the only ROTC program here at John Carroll was Transportation Corps.
Okay.
So everybody who graduated and was commissioned went to Fort Eustis, Virginia.
All right.
And we all went through a transportation officer's basic course.
Okay.
And there's alumni organizations of many of the ROTC graduates throughout the country. I mean, we're a very close-knit group.
Yeah. So did you see anybody that you went to school with here down there at Fort Eustis?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Because everybody had to go through there. So because I was stationed at Fort Eustis, it was like an alumni reunion. Every month, different people came through.
Right.
So I knew a lot of people. And then quite a few of us were stationed together at Fort Eustis.
We were a Transportation Corps school. There's two types of commissions, reserve and regular Army. And if you were what they call the distinguished military graduate, which is top 10%, and if you were recommended for regular Army when we went to our basic training, boot camp, whatever you call it, you could apply for a regular Army commission. I applied for a regular Army commission and received it. When you're a regular Army, you go into your first year is not spent in your, say, Transportation Corps, but you have to go to a combat arm. And they gave me aptitude tests, and they said, we'd like to send you to the missile field. And I said, well, that sounds exciting. So went to Fort Bliss, learned how to fire Nike Herc missiles. It was only when I got to Fort Bliss that I discovered that Nike Herc missiles carried nuclear warheads. They didn't tell me that initially.
So I ran the drug rehab center at Fort Eustis for 2 years, and then left, and then started my career at GM.
So why the drug rehab? I mean, you graduated in the business school with a concentration in marketing. What was it about your interactions with the commanding general that made him say this guy needs to be in this position?
While I was there, you know how this works. You spend 3 months doing your specialized training, active duty for training, and then you go out into the field or get assigned to another unit or go back to a reserve unit, which is what most people were doing back then. But while I was there, I was over. I met some people from the drug rehab center. I went over and helped them start it. They were doing painting and whatever. So I volunteered over there. And the general heard about this. And I get a call from the provost marshal, Joe Barry. And Joe said, Lieutenant, we've got you assigned as assistant officer in charge of the drug rehab center. And I said, can't do that. I'm only here for 3 months. I'm going home to my girlfriend and a career. And he said, well, I realize that. He said, but we'd like you to seriously consider it. The general has taken a personal interest in you, having known you through a mutual friend, and you've expressed an interest in this drug center, so we'd like you to do it. So I talked it over with my girlfriend at that time and my family, and decided to stay. And it was a wonderful experience.
We had two options when we were first commissioned. We were reserve officers as opposed to regular Army commissioned officers. We could have a 6-month tour of duty or a 2-year tour of duty. I chose to be a 6-month tour of duty with a lot of reserve time after it. So my orders were, after I got commissioned, I was a training officer for other second lieutenants that were coming into Fort Eustis. Well, at the end of my 5th month, this was in August of 1961, the Berlin crisis had hit, and John Kennedy, who had been elected in November of 1960 and became president, in August of 61, because of the Berlin crisis, froze all of the military personnel, including Jim Mason, for another year in the service. So I was getting ready to get out of the service in August of 61 and going to go to graduate school back in Illinois at Northwestern University. I was frozen for a year, but everybody was frozen. And so my military career was extended for a year. A new general had come on to the post and was looking for an aide. He had become the commander of the transportation school. I applied for that job and got it, and I became his aide. And so I worked for him. and he was a West Pointer, and that was my next job in the military.
My first year as a Nike Herc missile base, an underground missile base in southern Indiana, was really good. I didn't know anything really. I'd been trained and I knew the nuts and bolts of the stuff. So I went there, and my platoon sergeant was an E7 Sergeant First Class Junius P. Washington. You notice, I remember that. And he was African American. And he said, "Lieutenant, I'm going to ask your help." He says, "I'll make you a good lieutenant, but I have a problem." And he said, "What's the problem?" And he said, "Well, because of Army regulations, you have to live within a certain radius around the base." And he says, "This is Ku Klux Klan territory here. I can't live here with my wife and 5 children." He says, "I need to leave in Cincinnati, but I have to have an address of record within this." And I says, "Fine, would you like to use my address?" He said, "Yes, I would, and I'm going to teach you to be a good lieutenant." And he did. Yeah, that's really was a good thing in my life. So I served there for a year. The only noteworthy thing was we were doing drills one time. I was a launcher platoon leader. We had 3 underground pits, 6 missiles each. I can tell you this because it's not classified anymore. The base is closed. And each of those missiles had nuclear warheads of 2 sizes. Okay, 16 of ours were extra large, you would call it, and 2 were large. So, this was a lot of fun as a 21, 22-year-old. And one day we were doing drills, taking our missiles up topside, raising them up, establishing radar contact so we could fire them, because they were guided by radar to the target and exploded on command. Okay, and something happened on one of our missiles to start the nuclear chain. There's a high explosive, and it exploded. Okay, and the missile armed, and because it's still hooked up, we could see that the nuclear weapon was armed, and the clock was ticking. So this was, and I felt good about it because the rules at the time were that the highest ranking man in the area had to disarm. We were all trained in disarm. And the battery commander was there observing the training. It was a captain. I won't tell you his name, but I do remember it. And he saw what was happening. Everybody looked at him and he said, "Lieutenant, take charge." And he literally turned and ran. Turned out he went and got his wife, and they began driving west. Yeah. So the old warrant officer said, "Well, Lieutenant, looks like you're it." So the one brought me these big asbestos gloves. The other one read the book so I didn't blow up Cincinnati, and disarmed the warhead.
Wow.
So, and afterwards, there were only 2 places to get a drink in Dillsboro, Indiana. We went to the Legion Hall. We didn't pay for any drinks.
But while I was in the service, the first 2 months, you're in the transportation officer's basic course. And a little sidelight on that, I went in November of '63, and I was in maybe about 17 days. We were in one of the classes, and it happened to be on psychological warfare. All of a sudden, somebody comes in and says, "The president's been shot." And it was President Kennedy. And we all thought that, that was just one of the things for the class. And it turned out it wasn't, that he had been shot. So I was privileged to go with another officer to D.C., and I went through the rotunda where the president was laid out and saw the procession the next day, the parade. It was just a fantastic, fantastic experience.
And during the time that I was on active duty, I had a number of experiences which stayed with me throughout my entire career. If you want to define my career as beginning at the date of commencement until the present time that I talk to you 55 years later. One telling one that I always remember referred to the time that I was assigned as an officer to a court-martial. I sat on the court's martial, which under the then Code of Military Justice required a panel of officers to review some kind of an event that had occurred. The event that I'm thinking of that stays with me now was a young man 18-year-old young man who was classified as a deserter. Now, under the Code of Military Justice, if you go AWOL, away without leave, without letting anyone know where you are, more than 30 days, you were a deserter. That was a federal offense and required the FBI and Secret Service, if it was appropriate, to try and find you. This young man was found in the hills of North Carolina, and he was brought in to the nearest post, which happened to be Fort Eustis, Virginia, where I was on active duty, and he was put into the jail. There was a holding jail at Fort Eustis for short-term prisoners, if that became necessary, until a trial was held, a few days. And he was brought into trial, and I can remember sitting as a member of that panel, being impressed with the fact that when he came in, he wore around his neck, tied in the back, shoelaces, his boots. And he came in kind of unkempt clothes, old clothes. That was all he had, he said. And he confessed during the trial, right on, that he was a deserter, and that he explained that there were some family conditions, which I frankly long forgotten, that he felt required him to leave his military assignment, which was not at Fort Eustis, and not return to the military. And he was with his family someplace in North Carolina. That's all I remember. As the trial went on, it was a short trial, as you might imagine, a matter of a few hours, but in any case, one of the panel members said to him, "Why are you wearing these shoes tied behind you? Why aren't you wearing them around your neck?" And he said to the court, "These are the best shoes I have. I have no shoes at home, or I have shoes that have been handed down to me that have been worn to pieces." And he had old, tattered pair of shoes on. "I have nothing better. And these are shoes that I wear because A, I use them only in important occasions, and B, because I don't have anything else to wear." I had no idea that there were, although I had read about these things, that there were people who didn't have what I would define as some of the basic necessities of life. And that single incident has reminding me that there are people who don't have what I have, stayed with me throughout my entire life.
A landing zone in Song Bay, which was on the Cambodian border, and that was very hot. It got bombarded every night because it was next to a actual mountain called Black Virgin Mountain right near the Cambodian border. In Vietnam, there was very flat, but you saw this mountain, and the enemy forces would get up on that mountain at night, train their mortars, and on the landing zone at Song Bay, fire off their mortars at night. And at the landing zone, there was a communications tower, radio tower. The problem was if you kept it lit, then the enemy would go up in the mountain, sight their mortars, use that as a reference point to sight their mortars during the day, put them up at night, and when it was lit at night, they knew where positions were in that landing zone and could more effectively use their mortars. If you didn't light it, then helicopters were hitting it and killing people. So we had to make the decision, we're going to keep that communications tower lit or unlit. And then we decided to keep it lit because too many helicopters coming in there were hitting it and the guide wires holding it up. And the guys just had to endure unbelievable bombardment at night and at Song Bay. So, that was the type of decision you had to make where there wasn't a good outcome either way. You had to pick the best situation that you could.
We worked for like 3 weeks without a day off, trying to catch up. Finally took a day off, and I was just walking around Naha Port, and I see this little cemetery. It's not like the other Oriental cemeteries I had seen. It was like things you see at a national cemetery. And I walked in, and they were all U.S. Navy sailors, but not from World War II. They were from like 1844, 45, 46. And it turned out they were sailors who had died from Matthew B. Perry's expedition to make contact with Japan. And Okinawa was regarded by the Japanese as the garbage pit for Japan. So they buried the American sailors in their garbage pit. So it's just, you know, and to realize these things was fun.
Well, there's some mildly humorous stories.
Yeah.
One of my, I had a private or whatever that worked for me in the office. He was kind of a clerk, and he was a recovering alcoholic. And Bob Tingen, I think his name was, Bob used to work in supply. And when we were in need of anything, I would just mention it to Bob. And next thing I know, trucks are backing up to the drug abuse center with new mattresses and cans of paint and televisions and stereos and carpeting and God knows what else, all kinds of stuff. And I'd go out to sign for this, and Bob would say, "No, Lieutenant, don't worry, this. We just got to take care of it. You don't need to sign for this stuff." So he just pulled strings and got us whatever we needed. So
wow.
It was amazing how some of these recovering guys were paying back in a way.
The Army Transportation Center is Fort Eustis, so we had everything down there in terms of trucks, water vehicles. My roommate was a railway operating officer, airplanes, helicopters, and so we would ride around the post. One of my favorite things was the pilots down there had to get in flight time each month. So I would go with somebody. We would be in a bubble helicopter, fly down to Virginia Beach to Fort Story, leave the helicopter there, go to Virginia Beach, come back a couple hours later, and fly back to Fort Eustis.
I always worked for good people that I respected, admired, who fostered and mentored me. And the one time I didn't, I caught the lieutenant colonel in a massive indiscretion and covered for him. And the old sergeant major told me, he says, "Now, Lieutenant, or Captain, you just saved the colonel's rear end." Okay. He says, "Here's what I suggest you do." And he told me to get an immediate special officer efficiency report and to write my own recommendation for an Army Commendation Medal. And give it to the lieutenant colonel and tell him to sign it and get it signed. And I did. And that went into my record. And so those were good things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On Thanksgiving Day, and I was the officer in charge of the mess and was responsible for Thanksgiving dinner. Now, you know, in the military, Thanksgiving dinner at the mess is a family event. So you bring, if you lived in the area or if your family was visiting, you bring the family. And I was the gracious host, but I was responsible for that dinner. And afterwards, when the cleanup had taken place and everything was over with, the mess sergeant, a very grizzled veteran, said, "Oh, Lieutenant, you did a really good job of greeting everybody and meeting everybody. Why don't you come back and have a little something for me?" I said, "What are you going to have for me?" He said, "Have you ever had white lightning, Lieutenant?" I said, "No, and I don't intend to have white lightning." "Oh," he said, "it's really great stuff. 100 proof, you'd really enjoy it." I said, "Not today. I got to go home to my own Thanksgiving dinner."
What type of experiences from your military has directly affected your professional career?
Well, I think, first of all, the sense of mission, understanding your mission, understanding you have to take care of your people. I still, these days, take care first of my people, whether it's just simply parting the food when we eat together, making sure everybody else is fed before I'm fed, to the fact of communicating, having a clear communications, be there for your people. In the civilian world, often enough, people yell at the others and saying you're incompetent and so forth. In the military, do you realize that this is the assets you have, you're being given, and you have to make out the best of it. You don't have the liberty or the opportunity to have so many people available to you. You have to work with what you got. and there is where you have to apply better management of your resources. That I've learned in the military, I use it every day in my civilian world. Is that you are given an opportunity very early stage in your life to learn responsibility, which is uncommon. How can I say? Is an uncommon concept to many young kids getting out of high school. You learn in the military, even though I have not served on active duty, but you quickly learn, if you do seriously, that the outcome of any decision you make might cost the life of someone. And if you do take that seriously, you develop a bond and a sense of responsibility that is unparalleled in the civilian world. Perhaps only in the fire department, the policeman, you can find someone like that. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult to explain to a civilian what it means, the sense of responsibility you feel toward others when you make decisions in the military.
I felt that I learned a great deal about how to manage and organize and work with, and I mean work with and for people as a very junior officer. That doesn't mean every experience I had in the military was a wonderful one. Let me assure you, there were some awful ones. And some of them were awful because of things that I did, because I had done the wrong damn thing, to tell you the truth. But many of them were rewarding in the sense that they showed me that there were different ways to organize and to treat people. I was a lucky recipient of advice from not only senior officers, but also senior enlisted when I was commanding organizations, even on a limited period of time in that three and a half month period when I was on active duty. I had some wonderful senior enlisted men who steered me right and encouraged me to do things differently as I was commanding companies and interfaced with men and women frequently in disciplinary and motivation required areas, who taught me a great deal of how to function as a person who was responsible for directing in the contemporary term, leading those men and women. I learned a lot from them.
There's no better leadership, there's no better servant leadership training than what you get as an officer, commissioned officer in the armed forces of the United States. You're taught to service the troops first. You don't eat until they've eaten. You don't sleep until you walk the perimeter of the camp to make certain it's secure. You don't change into dry clothes until they've had dry clothes to change into, because, Michael, that's the only way to get people to follow you. They're not going to follow you if they don't think that you have their best interest in mind while you're accomplishing the mission at the same time. So, and the best definition of a leader that I've ever heard, and I think it's true, is a leader is someone people will follow to a place where they wouldn't go by themselves. And you can't get people to follow you if they don't think that you know, if you're out to get another medal, they don't care about that. You know, they want to know that you're going to protect them at the same time that you're accomplishing the mission. And I think that leadership training, now called servant leadership, and this has become a big buzzword in business now, like people just discovered it. Well, you know, the Army's been training servant leaders for 200 years. You know, it's not exactly, it's what great leaders have always done, you know. But now gurus are coming out, they're writing books on it, and, you know, teaching at great universities, you know, like it was some new concept. It isn't a new concept. It just hasn't been practiced. And I think that the Army really, at least back then, gave you that servant leadership training, which stayed with me throughout my life. So I think the combination of ethics, servant leadership, wrapped into a very deep faith is what I take away from both John Carroll and the Army.
So by thinking out of the box, by listening to the men and women with whom I worked, I learned as a result that the ability to contact with people and to listen to people and to work with and for, I want to emphasize both those, with and for, was critical. And I learned a lot of that through the military.
I guess the two things, it taught me how to manage. I don't know that I certainly learned the lessons. I didn't always practice them, but I certainly learned how to manage in the military. I guess that's it. I learned how to manage and learned how to be sensitive to the needs of others, both the staff and the patients. It's probably the best thing I could say.
You learn how to work with people in a variety of settings and circumstances, how to listen carefully, how to learn quickly, and how to adapt to the challenges that you're presented in circumstances like those that I've described.
Wow.
It was a lot. I learned a lot in the military. Never sorry I did it.
I guess I'd like to talk more about John Carroll. We talked a lot about the military. I feel like I really want to dive into your years at John Carroll. And we got some great stories about the 2 years that you spent in the Army. I'm sure there's some great stories about the 4 years you spent at John Carroll.
We were in the middle of the 60s, and it was the most fascinating, regardless of which side of the fence you were leaning politically, it was such a vibrant and alive time. There was so much going on, some good and some bad. You had the war, you had the Kennedy dying, and you had the civil rights movements, and you had the women's liberation movements, and you had just all kinds of stuff going on. And to try and be on a campus with that was fascinating. It was just fascinating. And I ran this organization, at least for the 1 year, called the Student Community Action Program. One of the neatest things we did was we had brought in speakers on various topics, right and left, about various things related to the war, civil rights, or whatever. And that experience at John Carroll was probably one of the most fascinating. And the people that you met, people like Ron Boland from the sociology department, who spearheaded the creation of this organization, and a lot of the other faculty members that helped out, and the Jesuits, obviously. It was a way of being involved in the 60s in a very positive, constructive way, and still feel it all around you. It's hard to describe how alive that decade was. And I have nothing seen it. We haven't seen anything since.
Well, what are some of the things I remember? I was here during the time when people were streaking. I never streaked. And I kind of kept take this in a good way, kept a hands-off approach to that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
There was an organization, and I must tell you, Mike, I was not a member of, called the Thursday Night Study Club, which assembled at a local bar. It was so named because the head resident of the dormitory, which was Burnett Hall, asked everybody where they were going, and one Thursday night they said, "Oh, we're going out to study." And he said, "Oh yeah, that's the Thursday Night Study Club." Of course, they all met at one of the local watering holes and spent a good portion of Thursday night socializing and doing what you do in bars. I was never a member of that organization. I want to repeat, so that those who might edit this tape later on will find my insistence upon the fact that I was not a member, but there were a good number of people who were at one point or another resident students, particularly, who could be found Thursday night studying, allegedly, through some kind of glasses of beer or other kinds of liquid refreshment.
Right on.
Right.
Some of the neighbors, I remember, were complaining about the morning Angelus that would be rung from the bell tower at 6 a.m. And so we got wind of that, and what we did was hooked up all of our high fidelity equipment, all of the boomers and woofers and tweeters and everything. We put them in the windows and then we hooked up together. I don't remember how we did this, but we played the 1812 overture with the cannons blasting all through our hi-fi equipment with the windows open. And I understand you could hear that for miles and miles away, you know. So, at John Carroll, at that point in time, there was a thing called Stunt Night. And it was in the Cullis Auditorium, and people got up and did skits, stunts. And all I can say is I won a trophy one year for Stunt Night.
Like, for what did you do on Stunt Night to win the trophy?
Honest to God, I don't remember. That's the God answer.
How did John Carroll, your experiences at John Carroll, shape your character?
Well, the sense of responsibility that once you are put in charge, you're in charge to serve others, not to serve yourself. I think that is the most important asset you learn as a student at John Carroll, and is the asset you have to use in your career as a manager. That the position you're given is a responsibility, not a privilege, and it's given to you so that you can serve it for the benefit of others, not for yourself.
How my experiences at John Carroll led to what success I've had. I certainly think the dorm life experience was a big part of that. It was no discredit to those who did not live on campus, but the dorm life was a society that you had to learn to deal with and relate to. And I was a dorm counselor for 3 years, and so that gave me even more opportunity to integrate and work with these people. So the dorm life helped. Certainly the Jesuit influence had a lot to do with it, and my maintaining my relationships with some of those Jesuits after I left Carroll helped a lot. So I give those two things, certainly the spiritual influence from the Jesuits and the camaraderie and the adult interaction we had on a day-to-day basis in the dorm and in the classroom with the students.
With a very strong sense of ethics and about what was right and what was wrong. And to do what was right, even if it was extremely, extremely difficult. That was a lifelong lesson.
The emphasis on preparation. The emphasis upon a sense of integrity to ensure that what you do is consistent with what your own personal moral values are. An emphasis upon the development of those moral values, a sense of responsibility. So I would hope that those are the kind of things that I leave behind, if you want, or I've left behind having retired from the university.
It's not just in the classroom, it's those business relationships that are lifelong lasting.
My college education, I think, prepared me well to be further taught in the Army. I had learned from working with folks here that I didn't know everything, and I was willing to listen to people, and that's been helpful all my life. I don't have a whole lot of opinions and things cast in cement, because as I learn more, I've changed some of my opinions and my ideas.
We talked a little bit before about, the connection with the Jesuits, and one of the things that we talk a lot about on campus here is, men and women for others. And was that kind of driven with you wanting to volunteer when you got down there? Was that driven by your connection to John Carroll?
That I went to a Jesuit high school too, and so I had 8 years of that Men for Others. It was all Men for Others back then. I'm glad to hear it's Men and Women for Others now. Yes, it's there. It plays in your mind whether you realize it or not, and I'm sure that had a lot to do with a lot of things I did here on campus as well. I was involved in a lot of community activities. And then that played as well, I think, in my desire to help these soldiers.
I just felt a strong feeling for the Jesuits. They have given me a sense of direction, and
their example to others, their willingness to do things that reach out, to do the leadership by example. I think that is so important. You know, it's easy to define leadership, but it's doing it that makes it so unique. And I always have felt that that the Jesuits have had that ability to do that. And if I take anything away from the Jesuit training, it has been that. When I was at Carroll with my classmates, we had, from our sophomore year till graduation, we took a philosophy course, and I thought that distinguished us from our peers. 18 hours of philosophy, and although we took a lot of other courses, whether it be social sciences or history or business, but I thought that separated the men from the boys, and most of that was Ignatius training and St. Ignatius training, and it made a major impact on our lives. And I think that spirituality carries through today.
And then when I retired, I decided that I wanted to give back to the people who helped me throughout my career. So I set up my own consulting company, and I primarily network and put individuals and businesses together to do business. So I make very little money, but I'm giving back to people who helped me, and I'm helping people who need help at this time.
The Jesuits, and now having Pope Francis as our Jesuit leader, we feel very blessed to have had Jesuits lead us in our formulation, and I couldn't be prouder to have been educated by them.
Yeah, I suppose there is something there. It's also what I call the Jesuit hook. It's not, and I always say it's not the hook, it's the barb on the end of the hook, because once it's in there, you can't get it out. Right. And I kid my Jesuit friends that they really do hook us into doing stuff. And then, for instance, this Jesuit Alumni and Friends group, we meet once every month or two and plan our luncheons, and then we always go over to Tom's Oyster Bar and have dinner and drinks as a committee, and so it's that camaraderie. And that's the way it was here at John Carroll too. I mean, I mentioned the Jesuit who works with us on the committee comes with us to the bar and has a nice dinner with us. And that's the way it was here at Carroll. The experience I remember most about Carroll is the Jesuit presence. It was not only in the classroom, which was probably more prevalent back then than it is now, but just the presence on campus. People like Father Don Smythe and Father Mike Lavelle back then, and eventually Father Joe Schell, who was president and then started the campus ministry program, and so many others. I think that's one of my fondest memories, is a very sincere interest in you as a person by the Jesuits.
And I just get the satisfaction of knowing that I'm doing something to help humanity.
Yeah. I volunteer twice a week at a warming center for the homeless at a Jesuit parish in Detroit. That's what makes me pop out of bed every those 2 days a week. The other days I sleep in a little bit more, but and I'm also involved in a major charity in Detroit I was president of last year, called the Old Newsboys, that we raise money to needy kids in the city. We give about 36,000 packages out every Christmas to needy kids in the city.
Wow.
I'm also involved in the World Union of Jesuit Alumni.
Mm-hmm.
I represent the United States along with another John Carroll grad in that effort. And we also have, I don't know if you're familiar with the Loyola Club here in Cleveland, but that we have a similar club in Detroit, and it's called Jesuit Alumni and Friends of Detroit. And any Jesuit alumnus or friend of alumnus from anywhere in the world, if you happen to live in Detroit area, we invite you to 3 luncheons every year, and we coordinate that. So I head up a steering committee for that. The rest of the time I spend in my cottage.
There you go. Yeah. If you had to give any advice to any of these students that are currently here, somebody that may watch this video, what would you tell them now?
Well, obviously to embrace everything they can while they're here on campus. It's lifelong learning. You know, to reach out and the friendships that you have are ones that you'll have forever. I know our reunions, our people come back. We're going to have our 55th reunion next year. Our 50th reunion 5 years ago, we drew the largest of any 50th reunion until the class of '64 beat us by a couple. But we had 104 classmates come back. They came as far as California to the East Coast, and what drove them to come back was the friendships that they've maintained. So, you know, I would say to the students who are going to get a chance to see this is that, you know, the relationships that they make are such strong relationships.
Well, you know, I would hope that they would use the institution. By using it, I mean to take advantage of the opportunities in classwork and outside classwork that are available to them. Now, let me be clear. I understand when I say use them, that students are not going to spend every waking moment studying their philosophy or even, God forbid, their communication texts. I wish they would. But the reality would be that I hope that as they do so and experience the institution in its instruction in the courses that they take, that they would recognize that there are other ways to look at things and new ideas and new approaches that can be taken. And those kind of approaches, which will sometimes come across in classes, not always, will stimulate them to think differently and to think in new directions and to use their skills in a different kind of way.
If I were to give anybody advice about what they're going to do in life, is to really believe in the value of what you're doing and convince the people that are working for you that you do in fact believe strongly in what you're doing. And that, I think, is as much as anything that I took back to General Motors. I rode a lot of horses at General Motors. There were different assignments I had in different departments, and I was a boss in a lot of them. And as I look back now, I think I do believe that my people, the people that work for me, really believed that I believed in what we were doing was important. And so that's what I think I carried away from the Drug Abuse Center. And what I needed to do there, I really had to convince even the soldiers, that the patients, that I was sincere in what I was trying to do to help them, and my staff would see me in my sincerity, and hopefully make me work that much harder.
I would say to the people who are going to see this, embrace those relationships and live them every day.
What do you look for in their personalities that makes you decide that person, you know, needs or can handle more responsibility? That person's reliable, and this is the type of person I want on my team.
A combination of sensitivity and not too much. If you're too sensitive, then you're not going to do what you need to do sometimes, the tough things. But you want to be sensitive enough to understand what your people are going through. I think I would also look for sincerity. Like I mentioned before, you want to really believe in what you're doing, and that what you're doing is important, and you want to be able to convey that to the people you're working for you, and look for that in them as well, and try and engender that. So that's what I would look for, and what I did look for in people that work for me.
Wow.
I looked at more of a liberal arts type of person to be hired, because they usually had the communication skills, the writing skills, the interaction with people, and that's not to downgrade somebody who has the business skills or something like that, but you can always teach that. The interpersonal skills are very difficult to teach. So especially in the jobs that I had, the interpersonal skills were very important. So that was a very important aspect in hiring people.
What you give back to your fellow man. And at the end of the day, I think that's what counts most. And for me, I hope that's a legacy that I can count with my wife and family and my fellow men, and that certainly is true with my fellow men here at John Carroll.